Welcome to this KEBAB webinar. KEBAB stands for Knowledge Alliance for Evidence-Based Urban Practices. It is funded by the Erasmus Plus program. It started in January this year, 2021, and it will run for 3 years as a research project. So this is the fourth session in the first webinar series of the program. We have as a speaker Vitor Oliveira, who is the Secretary General of the International Seminar of Urban Forum, as well as the President of the Portuguese Language Network of Urban Morphology. He is a professor at the University of Porto and is working on a new book due to be released soon, as far as I understand, called Morphological Research in Planning, Urban Design and Architecture, which is very, very relevant to the KEBAB project. Vitor, thank you for accepting the invitation. The floor is yours. You will be talking about the historico-geographical approach to urban morphology, and you've shared some materials with us and for the audience, which I have put in the chat for people to look at.
Hi everybody. Thank you, Ilaria, for this introduction and for inviting me to be with you today. It's a pleasure to come back to Nicosia, even if it's virtually. Due to some happy coincidences, I have been traveling to Nicosia at least once a year since 2016. So it is great to be with you in this session. I'm going to share my screen. Somehow I'm not being able to do it. I wonder why we do it. Oh, okay. Can you see it? Yeah, okay. So, as Ilaria has just told you, I will use, she told that by chat, I will use material from these 3 books, and you can download it in the chat if you want to know more about this approach. As you can imagine, it's very, very hard for me to present one approach made of many theories, concepts, and methods that have been developed at least since the mid-20th century in just 45 minutes. So I will try to focus on the more important things, and I hope that this set of issues raises your interest to know more about it. So I will start this presentation by very briefly going back to the origins of the approach in German urban geography in the end of the 19th century. And then I will focus on 2 geographers, M.R.T. Conzen and Jeremy Whitehand. And through their work, I'm going to give you some of the main contents that have been developed by this approach. And finally, the last part of this presentation will be on morphological regions, which is a concept developed by this approach, and on their relevance for planning practice. Initially, I thought about making a link also to architectural practice, because I'm an architect, and I would like to explain how this framework could be applied not only in planning but also in architecture, but I think we do not have time, so I will stick to planning. So the question, the main question that we can raise to start talking about this historical geographical approach, or even to urban morphology itself, is how can we start dealing with, or how can we start understanding cities? Most of us are architects, most of us in the audience, or students of architecture, and we are, or we have been trained to look at buildings, single buildings, and to talk about these buildings, to design these buildings. But here, the challenge is absolutely different. And the difference is not just the size, is the complexity. So the city is not one large building, and it's not just a collection of buildings. So what this approach gives us, and all the other approaches that have been presented to you and that will continue to be presented next week, is a way to address cities. It is a physical look at cities in the first moment, but hopefully, in the end, this is just the first layer for a more comprehensive understanding of socioeconomic and environmental aspects of cities. So in the case of this approach that I will be talking about today, the goal is to understand history and geography, and through that to have an accurate description of the urban landscape, and if we want to have some guidelines for practice, being this architectural or planning practice. So everything started in the end of the 19th century with the work of a number of geographers and some historians in Germany, in Central Europe to be more correct. And this table just gives you an idea of some main works that have been developed in about 4 decades. So here you have just the titles, which give you a flavor of what this research was all about. German city layouts on the ground plan of cities, the geographical location of large cities, and so on. What makes these studies so relevant? They started to introduce a new perspective on cities, and they share a common ground. Of course, they were all different, but they share a common ground. And one of the characteristics that all these researchers were trying to explore was to take maps not as an ended product, but as the basis for continuing to explore the history and the geography of cities. And the maps that these researchers used gave us a lot of information about the urban landscape that they were exploring. Here and in the next figure, you see 2 maps of 2 cities, Vienna in Austria and Gdansk in Poland, formerly named Danzig. And in these maps, you see something that for us it's quite common today, but it was an innovation back then, which was trying to give information about the building fabric, the three-dimensional nature of this landscape, and about land uses by the use of color. For instance, here the author, Hugo Assinger, is trying to give us more information about the building age and architectural style, while here Walter Geisler is trying to understand the city in terms of land uses, and at the same time he is giving us information about the height of buildings. For instance, when you look at the blue color, dark blue means higher height, and light blue means just 1 or 2 stories. So as you can see, it was all, or part of the research back then was to trying to continue to explore cities through maps. One of the researchers that concluded one important work in those 4 decades that I've mentioned is M.R.G. Conzen. Conzen was a student in the University of Berlin, and when he ended his course, that coincided with the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany. And as many other people that we admire, Conzen had to immigrate to the UK. When he get to the UK, he started to work as planner, and that is a very important thing to understand how the concepts that he would elaborate have the potential to be used in practice. So he was not just a geographer, he was a geographer that then was trained in planning and that did act as planner during some years. In the 40s, he went back to geography, and he started to teach, first in Manchester and then in Newcastle. It was in Newcastle that he has started to analyze a number of small cities, all very near Newcastle, and in particularly this small city, this town of Alnwick, Northumberland, that would be central to the development of this approach. So in 1960, and after a long period of study of this town, back then things were slower, and some might say better than today. In 1960, he has finally published this very small book about the urban history of Alnwick, where he would present us some of his main ideas about cities. One thing that I would like to refer is that this approach is a very comprehensive approach. It is made of many theories, concepts, and methods, and all these are very intimately related. So when we are using one method in particular, we can consider in an operational way similar to what I think you have seen so far, for instance, of segment analysis within space syntax. But in the end, each method, it's not just that, and it will not give you the results, the kind of results, quantitative, apparently with a lot of certainties that, for instance, segment analysis give you. So the knowledge that each of these methods will give you will influence, hopefully, the way how you design, but they will leave room for you to continue to think about the analysis that you have done, and about the possible ways of translating this analysis into design. And I must highlight the possible ways. So do not expect to find here any method or any theory that tells you exactly what you are going to do in professional planning practice or professional architectural practice. But on the contrary, I hope that, at least in my case, that what this approach gave me is a new way of looking at cities and of highlighting aspects that are invisible because they are structural, but that are more important than many visual aspects. So to understand Conzen's work, we have always to bear in mind this idea of a tripartite division of the urban landscape, meaning that each and every urban landscape has to be addressed considering these three elements of analysis. A full understanding of the town plan, of the building fabric, and of the land and building utilization. And when I say town plan, I mean how streets, plots, and the block plans of buildings are organized. Instead of block plans of buildings, if you want, you can use you can think of the concept of building footprints, which is pretty much the same thing. So apparently very simple, but it means, at least for architects, a change of paradigm. We were trained to think of buildings and to think of buildings as the most important aspect of the built environment. And what we have here is a view that places the highest importance on streets, because these are the most stable elements of urban form. These are the ones that continue in the urban landscape for decades, centuries, or millennia in some cases. Then on plots, and finally on how buildings are positioned within plots and how they relate to the street. And that is all in terms of a bidimensional reading. Only then Conzen starts to think about the building fabric, the aspects of the three-dimensionality of buildings. So just to illustrate streets and their arrangement in a street system, plots, and the position of buildings. And just with this, just by the patterns of combination of these three elements, we get to different types of built environment. And in each of these types of built environment, we create the conditions, for instance, to have a higher diversity or a higher segregation of people. Conzen has also developed a number of concepts to understand how time influences urban form. So I'm not going to address many of these concepts on the process of urban development, but I would like to refer these three because of their importance within the historical geographical approach. And these are Fringe Belt, Morphological region, and burgage cycle. And in a way, contrarily, for instance, to space syntax, which uses some methods, some concepts in very different scales, here, some of these concepts are more adequate to some particular cases, for instance, for some particular scales. For instance, Fringe Belt is more adequate to a reading of, to a macro reading of the urban landscape. The morphological region would be more adequate to the meso scale. It will not be very adequate to address a large city as a whole. While the burgage cycle is specifically considering the changes that take place within the boundaries of a plot. So the first of these concepts is Fringe Belt. And this image is very useful, at least I think, to explain the concept for the first time. According to this concept, cities do not grow in a continuous way. Once again, we all know that today, but back in the 30s, cities were commonly understood as entities that keep growing in a continuous way. Today, we know that that is not true, and the Fringe Belt concept was one of the concepts that changed the minds of people. And what the concept says is that cities are established and they grow, but at a certain moment in time, they found a barrier, they are confronted to, for instance, an economic crisis, and they stop growing. For instance, look at this map of Berlin, and more specifically at this zone number 1, which is the Old Town. All this area that is in the Old Town is mainly constituted by housing, because housing has been always, since we started living in cities, the strongest tissue of our urban landscapes. What happens is that during a certain period of time, other uses, other land uses, keep establishing around this old town, and they constitute a fringe. This fringe is not, it is not one plot, it is made of many plots. It's not something that is planned, it happens by chance. And when this, for instance, think of an economic crisis again, when this crisis ends and we start developing our city in its normal and mainly residential use, we get another belt of residential areas similar to the first one that contrasts with this one in the middle. So each process of growth of a city would have a first moment, mainly residential, a moment of stop that is mainly non-residential, a new process, a new stage of mainly residential use, and so on. And this concept gives you an idea of time, but it also expresses this temporal sequence on the ground, because we can, even today, this map is from the 30s, but even today, part of this is still recognizable if we look at Berlin or any other city. So here you would have the link for hearing Conzen himself talking about the origins of the concept. I will not go through all these videos, but it's just for you to, again, if you want to know more about each of these concepts that I'm going to address today. The second concept is the morphological region. As I said, I intend to look at it in more detail in the end. So for now, I'm just going to say that a morphological region is an area that has a strong homogeneity in terms of its form. And with that, it can be distinguished from the areas that surround it. This homogeneity in terms of form is given by this tripartite division of the urban landscape, particularly about by the patterns of combination of the town plan. So when you think about the homogeneity of a morphological region, we have to think that this homogeneity is in terms of the main patterns of streets, plots, and the block plans of buildings. I will go to the concept again in the last part of the presentation. And the last of these concepts that were developed within the historical-geographical approach is the burgage cycle. So here we are looking at what happens within each of these plots, each of the plots that make a city. The plot, as you know, or as you can consider, is the minimum unit of analysis in a city. And Conzen was so interested in understanding the macro scale changes or the mesoscale changes as the micro scale and simultaneously. So what we see in this image is the same plot. We are looking at this plot, this very long and narrow plot, in different periods of time, starting in 1774 until 1956. And what we see is that we have a main house and facing the street. This is the house of a bourgeois. And after a certain date, which is in the map of 1849, we see that the plot is full of small houses, houses for the working class, houses that were very small and precarious, and that were built to accommodate the population that was coming into cities and towns, mainly driven by the industrialization. This process that Conzen recognized in ANIC is common in many English towns and cities. It is common in my city, in Porto. It happened exactly the same when the industrialization process was established in the town. So it's a concept that can be recognized in many other places, and that is the main strength of this work on ANIC, is that the concepts, the ideas that Conzen give us about the town of ANIC are very important to understand the urban history of the city, but more important than that, they are common to many other places. And that is why so many people in different parts of the world took these ideas and keep elaborating them over time. The book was written in 1960, and it has been used in an increasing way, and it has been cited by more and more researchers over time. So very simply, Conzen wrote this book and some other papers. And in the end, when he retired in the early 70s, we can say that his work was mainly an isolated work, and despite its importance. And we can say that it was this geographer, Jeremy Whitehand, that transformed this individual contribution to our knowledge on cities into a real school of thought, a school that is shared by many researchers and that is open, meaning that we keep challenging these concepts and we keep making them more effective and more robust to the application to new geographical contexts or to new challenges that cities raise. So very briefly, Jeremy was born in Reading. He did his studies in that city, in the UK. And in the early 60s, he arrived at Newcastle. And it was there that during 3 years, he had worked with Conzen. And they started to influence one another in a way that would continue to be explored in the next decades, even after Conzen has retired from teaching. Jeremy has taught first in Newcastle, then in Glasgow, but it was in Birmingham that he established a notable research group, the Urban Morphology research group, that would explore Conzen's work in a way that was unprecedented. So to synthesize, why is Jeremy's work so central in this approach? Essentially for this, I don't know, 10, perhaps 10 fundamental contributions. First, he has created that group, the Urban Morphology group, in the early 70s in Birmingham. It was created in a perfect timing because Conzen, as I've said, was retiring from Newcastle, and the research that he was developing in Newcastle have no sequence after his stepping out of the university. So when Jeremy created the group in 1974, this has become the main research center within this historico-geographical approach in the UK. And it started to attract many of the people that are key references for us today in the field of urban morphology. The second contribution of Jeremy and of this group is on the International Seminar of Urban Form, ISUF. ISUF is today the main organization devoted to the study of urban form, and Jeremy was one of the people that was behind the creation of this group in the mid-90s. He had also organized the first open conference of ISUF in 1997. Again, he organized another conference in 2004, and he is member of the ISUF Council since 1996. So, as you can imagine, he's one of the central figures behind this organization. And even more visible, he has been the founder and the editor of the journal Urban Morphology, which is the main journal in the field. He has been the editor of the journal since 1997 until very recently, until 2019. So this would be more, these three contributions would be kind of institutional contributions. And the next ones that I'm going to present you are more substantive contributions, meaning that result more of his work as a researcher and not on his ability to organize and to motivate groups of people. So we can say, I think it's fair to say that Jeremy was one of the people that contributed the most to establish urban morphology as a field of knowledge, more than being concerned with his approach, although he did a lot to establish this historical geographical approach. He was working at least since the early 19th, and this is a very relevant paper, Recent Advances in Urban Morphology. He was concerned not only with the works that were being developed within this historical geographical approach, but with very different approaches in the field of urban morphology, trying to understand what was the common ground between these approaches and what were the singular aspects that each of these had. And yet, he was, as I said, trying to take the work of Conzen, an individual work, and trying to make it the foundation for an effective school of thought shared by many people. I think that this is the most visible aspect of that effort. This is a book that was published in 1981, and it was made of two different things. First, we have here 4 chapters that are the reproduction of previously written papers by M.R.G. Conzen, papers that were not very easily to get at the time in the turning from the 70s to the 80s. And more important than that, the first and the last chapters were written by Jeremy. And in the first chapter, he tried to, and these are long chapters, it's not just some words about the topic. In the first chapter, he was trying to understand what was the background behind Conzen's ideas. So how did these works that I referred in the beginning of this talk, how these works by those German geographers have influenced Conzen. And the last chapter was trying to understand how in the 70s other researchers were developing the ideas and the concepts that Conzen has launched in ANIC and in other of his papers. So in a way, with this book, Jeremy built the narrative of an historical geographical approach. And then he started to promote other important things for urban morphology. For instance, the idea that we have to continuously develop comparative studies. And here we have 2 very different types of comparison. First, to apply one same idea to different places. For instance, applying axial analysis to Nicosia and Limassol, for instance, and trying to understand what is unique in each of these contexts and what can be generalized. Another different comparison would be to pick one place, for instance, again, Nicosia, and apply very different perspectives on the physical form of the city and try to understand what each of these perspectives would give us to our understanding of the physical form of Nicosia. Another topic that Jeremy has brought to the morphological agenda was the explicit concern about the relation between research and practice. How do we translate our scientific knowledge that we keep improving to professional practice? What are the most effective ways to doing this? Apparently, this is a very easy task, but believe me, it is quite difficult, and there are not straightforward ways of doing it. He has also placed people at the center of morphological discussion, balancing the focus on the physical form with this concern of how the many different people that live in cities act on the constant transformation of these cities over time. And again, here a link. I will then give this PDF to Ilaria so you can get the links if you are interested, in this case, in hearing Jeremy talking about these ideas. The concept of morphological region that I will go through in the next part, and the development of the Fringe Belt concept. This was probably the most intense contribution of Jeremy Whitehand to the field of urban morphology. He has taken Conzen application in ANIC, and we have to say that while in Berlin by Herbert Louis the concept was absolutely isolated, in ANIC the concept was already part of a comprehensive morphological view of the town. And the following contributions, the main contributions that followed ANIC, I guess we can say that they were all promoted by Jeremy Whitehand. First, he gave the concept metropolitan scale. So what we see here is Newcastle and the Tyneside conurbation, and what we have is the different dynamics of the different centralities of this conurbation. Then after exploring this new geographical scale, he started to bring together urban morphology and urban economics. Then he started to offer detailed analysis of how the different plots that make each fringe belt were changing over time in parallel with the large changes of the fringe belt itself. And then he started to explore how the concept could be applied in practice, which in fact he did in 2005 in a plan for Barnes Green that is reported on a paper in 2009. And finally, he started to apply the concept in other geographical contexts, and right now, and the last paper was published in 2009, he has been exploring the ecological significance of fringe belts. So the last part, and I will try to be fast, although we started a little bit later. I try to do this in just 5 minutes to have like 10 for talking. The last part is about the morphological region concept and its potential to be applied in practice. First, why does planning practice need a concept such as this? As you know, planning over the last decades has not been very able to understand the physical form of cities. This is because of the rapid patterns of transformation, of course, but it is also because of the lack of tools to address cities. For instance, most planning practice keeps using the zoning mechanism, which means dividing the city in different parts, and that is okay. It is a process that has an internal logic. We divide because we understand that cities are made of different parts, but this division is usually based on land use, as we have done since modernist planning. So we divide based on land uses, sometimes to segregate some land uses, which has been dramatic in the last decades, and other times just to then, based on that land use division, to regulate urban form, which makes no sense. So the concept of morphological region can give a rationale to divide cities in different parts, and this division would be based on urban form itself. So how does the concept work? First, we have to understand history. So we need cartographic material as much as we can, I would say. The process is the reconstitution of the urban growth, and this here I'm only presenting one street and a set of street blocks that form this street. We have to understand how this part of the city grow, how are its plots and its buildings. And based on this, based on the recognition of patterns, and here this is just an illustration of the beginning of this recognition of patterns, of combinations between streets, plots, and buildings, we start to elaborate a map, an urban form-based map that captures all this diversity that we have in these photographs taken from this particular territory. The concept of morphological region is grounded on the idea that in many landscapes, this diversity continues. So even after defining a map such as this, we can continue to identify differences within each of these regions. We call each of these first order regions, and we can continue to identify differences between the different parts that make each of these regions based on our look at reality and at cartography. So I think this is it. But just to get back to the map, we can use morphological regions for analysis, and in the formulation of this concept, this was the main purpose, to use it to understand the complexity of the urban landscape. But I think it's a very powerful instrument to move from science to practice by transforming these regions into the zones that usually make the zoning maps of planning. And I will stop sharing. I think you don't see it anymore, right?
Okay. No, you stop sharing. Thank you very much, Peter. That was very interesting. You raised a big question in relation to Jeremy Whitehand's contribution, which is how do we translate scientific knowledge into professional practice? I'm not going to ask you to answer that question. It will probably bring the whole kebab project to an end if you did answer that question now. And you also said straight away, immediately, there are no straightforward ways of doing it. But then you moved on and you showed us a very, very practical way. Maybe there are many ways, maybe they're not straightforward, but clearly in the use of the morphological region, you found a very clear and direct way of applying research for the purposes of planning practice, which is what you were focusing on. So I'm going to open the floor to the audience. I don't know if anyone has any questions or comments. You can switch on your camera and speak, or you can type in the chat. Let's see.
Hello, if possible, I would have a question.
Sure.
Thank you very much for your lecture. My name is Greta, and I'm currently studying suburban areas. And I've been trying to apply the urban morphology concepts in these areas, but I always find this literature that criticizes the application of urban morphology to suburban areas because of the lack of history in these areas. So basically, they say that new suburban areas don't have that much of history background to apply such methods. But on the other hand, I recently discovered the book of Whitehand and Carr, which they study, if I'm correct, the suburbs of the 20th century in the UK. However, my situation is that my suburbs are like 5 years created area settlements. And I'm actually in a moment that I don't know if I am correct to apply such methods, or I will always have the criticize of history lacking background of my settlements. So I would like your opinion upon it.
Thanks, Greta. This is a very useful question. First, very simply, yes, you can apply it. It doesn't. The approach that I showed today takes into account history, but it's the history that you have. If you have just 5 years, it's that history that you have to consider. Suburban areas are made exactly of the same material that historical areas. The book that you mentioned is a very good example of application of morphological concepts to normal, ordinary suburbs, because urban morphology is not ideological. There are no good and bad landscapes. There are just landscapes to be analyzed or designed, if that is the purpose. And you have a lot of excellent examples over time of application of different morphological approaches, not just historical geographical approach, but different morphological approaches to suburban areas or to metropolitan areas. Another usual idea is that urban morphology is just applicable to historical centers or cities that are very tiny. And since the beginning, for instance, I showed the map from 1967, where Jeremy Whitehand started to apply the concept of Fringe Belt that was applied in the tiny town of Anik into a whole conurbation area. So all these landscapes are made of the same materials, so they can be analyzed with some limits, of course, with these concepts that are shared, with these concepts and methods that are shared by the urban morphology community. If you want, because now I have to give fast answers, but if we want, we can exchange some emails on this. I would be very happy to
I'd really appreciate it, actually.
Okay. And but please keep in mind that you are right to use it, and there are a lot of good examples for you to use or to follow or to bear in mind of this understanding of suburban areas based on urban morphology.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I will do so.
Thank you. We have a question in the chat. We'll read it out. Thanks, Vitor, for an excellent presentation. What are your views on new developments in the field when the digital becomes more driver of urban interaction and change?
I'm not sure if I understood the question, and I wonder if Saket could come on into the camera and raise it
hello.
again.
Yeah. Hello. This is Saket. Yeah. Hi. Sorry for the very fine thanks. Sorry for the cryptic framing. So we are looking at morphology, a structure which has evolved from the historic geographic perspective, right? So the history and the geography becomes the driver in the way the urban structure and the patterns have evolved over time. And now we are, at least I think I'm seeing that the digital landscape becomes one more pattern, one more driver, which is shaping the urban structure. So I'm wanting to know, are there thoughts or developments in the study of urban morphology which brings in these dimensions of interaction which are not driven by history or by geography, but maybe through a digital lens?
Okay, I would say that for urban morphology, the first layer of analysis is urban form, but immediately it starts addressing flows and networks. So I think that your concern on the digital becomes apparent when we start to develop our morphological understanding. I have presented one approach, and I think that you will be confronted in the end of this sequence. I think that you will be confronted with three approaches. Perhaps space syntax makes that more apparent because it is very explicit how this morphological look at cities considers in an equal basis the form and the social. And the social is understood not in terms of a static thing, but in terms of dynamic interaction. Ideally, I would say that for you to understand how these aspects of the digital are being incorporated in urban morphology, in a very, very explicit way. Yeah, I would suggest you to have a look at the work of Michael Batty, because he has been leading this way in the last years, particularly in the last 2 decades. He has a new book which talks about the unpredictability of cities, which is something apparently a bit strange for someone who has building all these sophisticated mathematical models to understand reality. But his new provocation, it's a book of 2018, where he says that despite all this, we cannot predict the future of cities because our interactions are so much, and they are built on the different inputs of so many people in an uncoordinated way that we cannot predict how cities are going to be changed in the future with all these incorporations that you mentioned in your comment. And so his challenge is that okay, we cannot predict, but we can start to invent future possible futures for our cities. So definitely my suggestion for you to understand the things that you mentioned would be to get your hands on some of the books of Michael Batty.
Thank you, White. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Let's see, are there any other questions or comments for Vitor, either live or in the chat?
Yes, I have also another question. Since previously we had a lecture on space syntax and also lots of literature, and in the Urban Morphology journal there is mention of space syntax and urban morphology, I just wanted to know, and also you mentioned in the lecture previously, I just wanted to know if the only way to understand the social aspects of an area through urban morphology is by studying population data and economic data, but also by integrating space syntax approaches. I mean, are there any other ways which urban morphology methods and tools can give us, let's say, some interpretation on the social aspects of the area? If I was clear.
Yes, you were. And again, I have to say that there are many ways. Space syntax is just a way of understanding the relation between space and society. And in the, I would say that all, perhaps the process typological, it's not so explicit, but I would say that in all morphological approaches, there is this idea that we develop a first reading of urban form, and that is like a first layer, and then you have to, depending on the purpose of your studies, you have to place here other layers of the social and the economic or the environmental. So there are a lot of, and again, I can then send you the references. There are many studies that try to understand how the physical on the one hand and the social, the economic and the environmental on the other hand, they combine it. How are one half is influenced by the other half. There is a vast literature on that. From within space syntax, I would say that one key reference is the work of Laura Vaughan, to Emily Tallon in the United States. But it all depends on exactly what you want. For instance, in my research, one thing that I'm trying to understand is what patterns of combination of urban form are more favorable for diversity in terms of a social structure. So I'm not trying to understand what urban forms are more tend to promote the creation of rich areas or poor areas, but what types of urban form tend to promote diversity of people through many social perspectives, or what types of urban form tend to promote a higher diversity, a higher economic diversity. So there is a vast literature on that, and that is a key thing, because one thing that distinguishes, I think I can say it like that, urban morphology from, I don't know, some architectural theories, is that we do not see urban form by itself. So urban form is the result of socioeconomical processes, and it has an impact on the way how we live cities. So I would say that none of us tries to understand urban form by itself, but as a first step to understand many different things that happen in cities. None of us is very concerned with, I don't know, the aesthetic of the urban landscape, but more concerned about the structural aspects of this urban landscape and how do they interact with the main dimension of our life in cities.
Thank you. So basically the layer approach that you say, first layer, second layer, is applicable everywhere.
I think that it's a good way. I'm not elaborating, but I think it's a good way to understand what an urban morphology study is. I think that a common ground is this first layer of reading the physical, but then other layers will come on the top of that, depending on the purpose of your investigation.
I understand. Thank you very much, Professor Ria.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? I think it's going to be your last chance. No? Okay. Thank you very much again, Vitor. I'm looking forward to a future day when Planned in Practice will use the morphological region as its administrative area rather than zoning or other forms of abstract administration of city areas. Thank you to all the audience as well and our students who joined the lecture today. We have another session, the final one in this series, next Wednesday. So look out on social media for the link and the description of the webinar next week. I hope to see you all again soon. And thank you very much again to everyone.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you.